Welcome to the 6-part mini tutorial series where I take you through the process of creating a stylized game asset. This series assumes that you have an understanding of Maya and you have an understanding of Substance Painter. If you would like to learn more about 3D, or if you would like to learn more about the softwares, check out our courses on Udemy. You can find a link for that down in the description. In this section of the tutorial series, we're going to take a look at UVing our low poly game asset. We're going to take a look at doing an explode bake inside a Substance Painter, how we have to set that up in Maya and export it for it to work. And we're going to also troubleshoot some baking issues and take a look at our first set of maps. So heading into Substance Painter, we're going to want to set up the high poly so that we can have a bake that specifies different areas, which is called an explode bake. We also need to set up UVs on our object, so we're going to tackle that first. Before we get into baking. So remember, in any sort of baking pipeline, what you are doing is you're taking the detail and you're baking it to the UV map. So what I'm going to do is just take my high poly here. I'm going to Shift P to unparent all these. I'm going to delete their history, freeze their transform, and we're going to come back to this. We're going to just take Control G and slap that in a layer here so it disappears. We'll just make that our HP for high poly. And then we're going to bring back our low poly mesh here. Now, an important step I have not done is freeze the transforms here, so make sure you do that. We're going to modify freeze transforms, and we're going to get into UVing this guy real quick here. So let's go ahead and switch to our UV workspace so we can save some screen real estate. Once again, if you have two monitors, just throw up that UV editor on your second monitor. It's a lot easier than working with this, but so everyone can see what I'm doing, we'll go ahead and come here. Now, when UVing a barrel or any cylindrical shape, I like to approach it in chunks. So I'm going to come up here and we're just going to create a camera-based projection. And I'm going to start by cutting the outer edges here that make up the outer barrel. So we're just going to double click those. We're going to do a quick cut. And then I'm going to do the same on the top, same on the bottom, do a quick cut, and then do one on the interior here and do one on the side and cut. So that way we get our cuts. Now, if you unfold this, it's not going to be exactly what we want. It's going to be a bit of a mess here, so we still have some edits we need to do. There are a few areas that are going to be somewhat okay, which is going to be the tops. These are okay, but we're going to want to make this into something we can paint easily. When you think about barrel, we're dealing with wood grain. It has a good amount of directionality to it, so we're going to want to be able to match that, right? And do so in a sane manner. Now, what that entails is using a cylindrical projection. So with this midsection here, I can just double click this shell. We can come up here to create and we can do cylindrical. And what's nice about Maya cylindrical is it will bias this to be flat. And that's exactly what we want. But we do want to check the stretching and textile density. So if you turn on your checkerboard here, you can get a feel for that. Now, you want this to be as square as possible. So if I just scale this up, we can see those aren't really square. So you can either pull it inward here to kind of squash it a bit more or stretch it a bit more till they get square. And that's usually the approach I like to take. And you just want those to be as close to square as possible. Now, don't worry about the size. We're going to lay that out. The next thing to decide is the top areas here. When you take a look at the barrels here, you'll see a lot of the times we're going to paint just some edges here. You'll see in this case, they continued the wood grain across there. And if we take a look at the top of a real barrel, we might have to find a reference for that. So we could look up something like barrel top. We could decide how we want to approach it in terms of our stylization and go from there. Let's try and find an image. So something like this. And you can see it has a bit of wood grain to it. Interestingly enough, it looks like it's running for the most part the opposite direction of the board. So I'm going to copy this image and just bring it into my reference board. And we can look for a handful of those. You can see this one has sort of a roughness to it, kind of sawed off. So it really depends on what we want to do in terms of stylization. Now, regardless though, we want to do whatever takes up the least amount of space in our UV shell, because if we're doing a low poly stylized asset, we're going to want to have as much room as we can get. So if we come to this top part and we just go to edge and you do something like cut and then you unfold it, I'm going to double click modify unfold. You may or may not get this result. Sometimes it gives you a nice result, sometimes it doesn't. In this case, it did. Usually it has to do with the number of sides inside of a cylinder, in my experience. So since we're only using 8, it unfolded okay. But if you're using something like 16 or 12 or 20, there's a good chance it wouldn't unfold this way. Now we want this to be straight, so it's easy to paint, so we can just do a modify straight UVs. And this last one's not perfectly straight. You can just grab that, scale it. And if you scale this way up till you can see that checkerboard, you're going to see it's all off kilter and skewed. That is fine. Believe it or not, that is completely fine. There's nothing wrong with that because this top part's going to be pretty subtle. And if we're painting directly on here, who cares? Now, let's see if the bottom one gives us the same behavior. I might want to match my UV seams up, though, with this main line, just so we have one running down one area. So I'm just going to cut that area. We're going to do a quick cut, move, and sew there. And because it's in a straight line, it will work fine. Come down here and cut. And then we're going to want to start making sure we are just doing shell selections by double-clicking in face mode or UV mode and modify unfolding. So that way we don't accidentally undo any of our work. Now, this one's a little bit wild. If you ever need to manually do a straightening, what I like to do is just select the first UV, and I'm doing this in UV mode. Shift select to the last, D, V, snap, scale, and then do the same up here. So that way you're pretty much set. And then you can do a quick modify straight UVs on this, and then come to the tail end, flatten that, and then we can scale this. And once again, just see that's a mess. Now, as far as these two go, these inner lips, we could do the exact same thing here, doing a create cylindrical. So that way we just get that nice cylindrical projection. You'll notice these ones are even more stretched, and we do want to make sure the UV seam's aligning. Because I use the default on the first one, it is, which is fine. But we are going to want to scale this out until we start to see these be perfect little squares. And once again, I know these do not all match. That is perfectly fine. That is actually what we're going for right now, because we're going to manually paint these anyway, and we want it to be easier to paint. We're not worried about the stretching. All right, I'll do the same for the bottom one here, and we can scale that out. Now, the bottom and the top are interesting because we're actually going to want them to share a UV shell, and we can think about how we want to approach this. There's a number of ways. What I'm going to do here to save UV space is I'm actually going to hit Tab on this bottom area here. I'm going to do a quick select and grow, and just grow this to the outer edge and hit delete. And once we have the other top part UV, we're just going to bring that back. So now that we have these laid out the way we like, the next step is to actually work on our UV layout. A very quick way to do this is just go to Modify, Layout here into the options. And we can set a couple things here. For the pre-rotate, I'm going to leave this to off since these are rotated where we want. For pre-scaling, you want to preserve 3D ratios. I'm just going to have translate down here, and we can pick our size. Since we're doing stylized, let's go for 1024. 1024, I believe, has a shell padding of 8x8. If we forget, though, you could look up poly count, edge padding, and they have a really nice quick reference for anyone who needs to know edge padding. So down here, you'll see that 1024 is 8 pixels. So we're just going to do 8x8 for that one. And then delete history if you haven't already on your object, because sometimes that messes up, and freeze transforms because scale is applied here, and just hit apply. And what we'll get is something like this. And this is actually pretty good. It could be better. We want to maximize the space as much as possible. So on this top one here, first off, I'm going to straighten it. So we're painting straight lines, and I am going to move it upwards. The other thing I might want to do on the top one, as strange as it sounds, is adjust the topology a little bit here to make sure we're painting in the correct direction. But I want this to take up as much space as it can here. We don't want to have any empty space inside our texture atlas if possible. And if you scale it up and you want to use this layout again here, you could switch this to not preserve 3D ratios and then hit apply. And that will apply your 8 padding, but with a new scale, which is kind of cool. Okay, so let's talk about directionality. We want this to match the directionality here of our wood grain as much as possible. So for example, if I were to apply a tiling texture, I'd want it to roll from this face here across this face here. And I actually have that set up correctly. You'll see if I turn my high poly on, we can see the cracks flowing that way. And if I select my shells here, you can see they run that direction, which implies that I actually have this set up correctly. Okay, so just make sure that the wood grain is all running the same way on your barrel, and that's going to make your life a lot easier. Now that we have that set, we need to bring this down to be the bottom again to share this space. So what I'm going to do is duplicate this, Control D, and we can do this a number of ways. A really easy way is to just flip it. You can do a modify center pivot on the new duplicate one. You can actually take scale Y and set it to -1. That will flip it, and then you can delete what you don't need, as weird as that sounds. So that's flipped. We can come in here and just delete out what we don't need. And now this will have perfectly overlapping UVs and be in the exact spot we need it to be. From there, you can do a mesh combine and then highlight the vertices of the merged area. We'll see if we press 3, you get that really sharp edge there. And up here, you can see how you're getting these rounded edges. That's how you can tell that it is not merged. You can do an edit mesh merge and merge those all together. And now that is UV'd. Those are overlapping and they're sharing space. Advantages to that, it takes up less space in our atlas, but also if we're hand painting, we only have to hand paint it once. However, if we're going to do a bake, we need to offset these. The reason why is bakes record to a specific area, and it will record twice, because remember, UVs are 2-dimensional space, so it is going to write to that location twice. So a trick to get around this is we can right-click this into UV shell mode, and then I'm just going to shift-click and select all the bottom UVs here. And if we go ahead and pull up our UV toolkit, you can come here to transform. Down here in move, you can set this to a unit of 1, which will offset this by 1 quadrant. And then you can just press the over arrow to move those over to the next quadrant. What this will do for us is it will allow us to keep overlapping UVs, but when it bakes, it's not going to bake to this. It's going to not see it. So that way we don't get a double bake, we just get a single bake when it comes to things like our ambient occlusion and normal map. So really useful technique. So from here, we're going to delete the history. We're going to save because we've done our UVs here. We'll just go ahead and make this our barrel 02. And we're ready to prep this to go into substance. So let's go ahead and talk about how we're going to do that. When it comes to baking, what the 3D software is going to do is it's going to look at the object, it's going to create a shell around it, and it's going to project rays into it. Now, depending on your setup, you may be able to use a different layout. Let me go ahead and switch to our normal workspace here so I can bring back my high poly. One of the things we're going to run into is that we're going to really need to push the envelope, which is the search area of this projection, for our low poly barrel so it encompasses the metal portions. What that means is it's probably going to overlap with our center area and it's going to create a pretty big mess. So what we can do is we can perform something called an explode bake, and that's where you separate elements from the body out of each other so that when you bake, you can use identifiers to specifically designate what should be baking to which. And that's a really useful technique inside of Substance Painter. So I'm going to take the top one here and the bottom one here, and I'm just going to edit mesh extract these guys out of here. So that way they are separated from the main body. And I should be doing this on the low poly. So make sure you're doing it on the low poly. And then I'm just going to take all my low poly assets and hit Shift P so I can see these. From here, I'm going to delete history on these. And then I'll just take the top one and the bottom one and do a mesh combine and then delete history again. And we'll go ahead and just name the barrel underscore low. This naming convention is extremely important because it is how we're going to do the explode bake in Substance Painter. So let me explain the process. What you need to do is all the low poly ones, you need to have the suffix _low on. And all the high poly ones, you need to have the suffix _high. That's the default Substance Painter uses. I just use the default because I find it's a little bit less buggy than setting a custom. The other thing we need to do is make sure that the low poly and high poly appear in the same order in the outliner as each other. So for example, I have barrel low on top here. I'm going to want to have barrel high on top, if that makes sense. So we'll talk about that when we get there. But we'll go ahead and make this top _low. So now we have the barrel low, the top low. And that's going to take care of our low poly. So I'm going to just give it a layer and hide it. And then we can come into our high poly here. Now with high poly, I'm going to combine the various elements that need to be combined. So I'm just going to take all these ones here that make up the barrel, combine those. And it pops right out of there, which is great. We're going to name this barrel high. What I like to do is double click the name of whatever the low equivalent is, and then Control V to paste and switch this to high. The reason I do that is to ensure the naming conventions are exactly the same. I can then take the top piece and the bottom piece here and do a mesh combine. And just like previously, we'll pop those out of there. And then we can make this a top high here. So we are good to go there. And then we can just delete the low mesh. And what we should see now is our high poly and our low poly ready to go and overlapping. But we still need to prep some aspects of our high poly potentially. But I think it actually is good to go. I don't think I want to press the 3 button. I could use the 3 button to convert these, or I could just soften them. I have to kind of decide here what would be best for this asset. I actually don't think it's going to matter at the end of the day, but I think it would be better if I just grabbed this and did a mush display soften edge across the whole thing. We have enough bevels here to actually make it bake smooth, so I think that's good enough. I don't think we need any conversions, which is pretty cool. Okay, so delete history on that, and we're almost good to go. The next thing we want to do is we want to prep this to have an ID map. ID maps allow us to ID specific areas by color, and they can be used for masking in applications like Substance Painter. So I'm going to ID the wood separately from my metals. I'm going to go into face mode here and just shift double click these wood pieces so I get all the wood areas around here. Then we can assign new material and just grab a Lambert. And for the Lambert, I'm going to make this a bright red color here and just name this wood. And I'm going to do the same for the top and bottom. I'm just going to select these in their object mode, assign existing, and assign wood. Then for the metal rings, I can come in here to face mode, shift double click. I'm going to assign a new material here. We'll grab Lambert. And for this one, I'll just do bright green. And I like to use red and green as my defaults when just having 2, because they're opposite colors and it makes it for easier selection on the picker. But blue would be fine too, or pretty much any other color, as long as red's not a high factor. But this will get us all set to go to Substance. So make sure you delete history across both these again and save, and then we can export these. So what I'm going to do is select the barrel low and top low. We're going to do a file. We're going to do a quick export selection. I like to just use this as an OBJ. I find it works easier. And what I like to do is come in here to source images, create a new folder here, and just name this barrel. And then inside a barrel, I'll create a section here called bakes. And we'll go ahead and just make this our barrel _low. We can then come into the barrel high, the top high, hit Control G, and we can go ahead and make this our barrel _high, export selection, and those should be good to go. Now, just some reminders. We did offset these UVs on the low poly. So if we take a look at the low poly here, and I actually have the display layer turned on, which I may have to re-export, but I'm pretty sure Maya is fine with that. Remember, we did do this offset. So you got to make sure that offset is there for this bake to turn out the way it's going to on my screen. Okay, now let's go ahead and hop over here to Substance Painter to do our bake. I'll come to Substance Painter here, and we'll go ahead and come up here to File, New. We'll set this to 1024 since that is what we are working at currently. We'll go to Select here to select our barrel. So we'll go into Source Images, Barrel, Bakes. We'll go ahead and grab the barrel low, and I'm going to copy this directory just in case I need it again. We'll go ahead and open that up, hit OK. And there is our barrel. Now, I'm already noticing an issue here, and we're going to talk about that, but I want to go ahead and bake first so you guys can see the issue. To bake in Substance Painter, you're going to want to find your texture settings here and navigate to that menu. You can scroll down here and go to Bake Mesh Maps. We can then plug in our high poly here, our high definition mesh. Plugs right into here, barrel high, and we're going to want to tweak a couple settings. Now, this is a newer feature in Substance, which I absolutely love. It's a preview that shows you your bake envelope. The way the bake envelope works is it uses this rear distance and this max frontal distance. Generally speaking, I always crank rear distance all the way up to 1. Rear distance is basically for things like cavities and holes. So in this particular case, it's going to be for things like the cracks in the barrel. Then the max frontal distance, if we increase this, you'll see it's going to expand the shell so that it consumes the red area. Any area that is red indicates clipping. What that means is it's not going to be considered in the bake for the maps. So you're going to want to make sure that you have it in the bake for the maps. So you're going to want to increase that frontal distance. Now, you'll notice these purple lines. These purple lines are going to be problematic because what those are indicating is a hard edge. Hard edges inside of things like normal bakes give you a nice crisp edge, and they are not ideal unless you have something like a 90-degree angle. So what that means is I'm actually going to have to take a step back and redo all of this, which is okay. It's always good to show that process. It was me going a little bit too fast, making mistakes, but we'll be able to tackle that when we get there. Now, moving down, we have anti-aliasing. Anti-aliasing is the smoothing of pixels, so you can see how this looks super jaggedy. If there's more anti-aliasing in this view, that would be smooth. With anti-aliasing, usually you want to go to about 16. 64 is almost always overkill, and it makes it take really long. So I'm going to do 16 here. Now, the next trick is this section here called match. Match is how we do our explode bake. You'll see down here, low poly mesh suffix is low, high poly suffix is high. That is exactly what we set up inside of Maya here. But in order to match, you need to make sure it's set to by mesh name, and then it's going to use these suffixes. If you have it by always, it matches everything regardless of name. So it doesn't use the namespace matching. You want to use by mesh name here. Now, for our test bake, I'm going to turn off everything but the normal map here. And then I'm going to click Bake Selected Textures, and we're going to return to painting mode so you can see the issue we're getting with the hard edges. If you take a look here, you can see this really hard area along here going this way and that way. You see that crisp line? That is because we have hard edges applied to those areas. And you can really see it across the metal here, how it has that sort of pinch. In order to prevent that from happening in your bakes, you need to use softened edges. Now, the basic rule when it comes to baking is if you have a 90-degree angle, you use a hard edge. And if it's not a 90-degree angle, you use a soft edge. And that goes for pretty much everything. So just be aware of that. So how are we going to fix this? We're going to hop over here into our Maya file. We're going to turn on our barrel low here. Take a look at this and look for any 90-degree angles. And we actually don't have any because we took that interior edge and made it at an angle. And we're just going to do a mesh display soften edge. So this is going to be what it looks like. Now, by default, you might think, well, that doesn't quite look right. But if you're going to use a normal map, it is. And if you're not going to use a normal map and you're just going to be using a painted map, it doesn't matter because you can harden soften edge later after you get out of something like Substance Painter. So we're going to delete the history here and re-export. So we'll just do a file export selection, kick that back out as low, and redo the process here in Substance. So we're just going to go to New, 1024. We're going to select the barrel low. We're not going to save this one because we don't want it. And now we're going to bake this without those hard edges. You can see how soft it is. So let's come back to Bake Map. Go ahead and apply our high poly here. And then set up our max rear to be max, and then max frontal. Just go ahead and get past that metal portion. Anti-aliasing, I'll set that to 16. For match, I'll do by mesh name. And I know this is going to work, but just for test's sake, let's turn off everything but the normal map. We're going to set the common settings up here to 1024, and we're just going to bake that out. And there we go. Now you can see we don't have those weird lines. We have nice clear lines. There are areas here you can see we still have a line across this edge. So that's something I might want to check. Do we have a hard edge there? That discrepancy might actually be from UV stretching. And what's kind of the trick to that? Well, are you going to ever see the barrel that close? You can see how it reads fine from a distance. Other areas that look really great are the metal. You can see how that just has a really nice lap around here, and just all around we've gotten a really nice look to this. So I think this is a pretty successful bake overall. Now let's come back into the bake map, and you'll see if I look in here, we don't have a purple line, so it's not a hard edge issue. We can already determine that's a UV issue. We can then proceed to grab what we want out of here. I'm just going to grab world space, ID, ambient occlusion, curvature, position, thickness, and I don't really need height. I think it stops there. So we'll just go ahead and grab those. Those are the defaults. You absolutely do not need all of these. I like to just grab them in the off chance that I end up using a filter that accesses that information. And you never know what you want sometimes. Doesn't really cost you anything to have extra. So why not? Now I'm going to click bake, and we're going to bake this out. And then we can check out the result we get and see if all of our maps look good. There are a few tweaks we might be able to do to make the maps look even better, but this will give us our base set of maps to work with, and then it's up to us how we want to approach this moving forward. It can take a while to bake, so just kind of give it its space, and then we can hop out here and we can check things out. Now, what you're going to be seeing initially is just two maps. You're going to be seeing the normal map and the ambient occlusion. Now, you might want to check and see if your ambient occlusion has any weirdness to it. In this case, I don't think it does. You can also come up here to the display. If you scroll way down to the bottom here, you can find the ambient occlusion, and that actually looks nice. Now, also double check your overlapping areas. You'll see my overlapping areas look good. So at the end of the day, this is a perfect bake for us. This is going to work out really well. Now, whenever you get a good bake, save. That is when you save. So let's do a file, save as, and we're going to put this into our source images folder under barrel, and I'm going to just make this our barrel underscore texturing underscore 01. Usually I don't do multiple substance files. I usually just have one substance file, so just something to be aware of, but that will get us set up and ready to start texturing. So the next step is to decide how we're going to approach texturing, if we're going to use pre-built materials, if we're going to hand paint it, if we're going to bring in our own stuff from outside of Maya. And when it comes to stylized, it really is going to depend. So at this point, what you would want to do is just take some time studying your references and deciding, okay, if I'm going to approach this, how I'm going to approach it, but also think about your own preferences for tools. How comfortable are you painting in something like Substance Painter versus painting in something like Photoshop? Is there something you could create in another application like Photoshop or Substance Designer faster than you could create inside a Substance Painter? Are there tools that could expedite the process inside of something like Substance Painter or Substance Designer or Photoshop? All right, so go ahead and take those into consideration, and we'll dive in and take a look at kind of some quick ways to texture this now. Thank you for watching this tutorial series. Be sure to like and subscribe for future content.